Nietzsche selected Aphorisms. Part 1. From Human, All Too Human. 45. Twofold historical origin of good and evil. The notion of good and bad has a twofold historical origin. Namely, first, in the spirit of ruling races and castes. Whoever has power to requite good with good and evil with evil and actually brings requital, that is grateful and revengeful, acquires the name of being good. Whoever is powerless and cannot requite is called bad. A man belongs, as a good individual, to the good of a community, who have a feeling in common, because all the individuals are allied with one another through the requiting sentiment. A man belongs, as a bad individual, to the bad, unquote, to a mass of subjugated, powerless men who have no feeling in common. The good are a caste, the bad are a quantity, like dust. Good and bad is, for a considerable period, tantamount to noble and servile, master and slave. On the other hand, an enemy is not looked upon as bad. He can requite. The Trojan and the Greek are in Homer both good. Not he who does no harm, but he who is despised is deemed bad. In the community of the good individuals, the quality of goodness is inherited. It is impossible for a bad individual to grow from such a rich soil. If notwithstanding one of the good individuals does something unworthy of his goodness, recourse is had to exorcism. Thus the guilt is ascribed to a deity, the while it is declared that this deity bewitched the good man into madness and blindness. Second, in the spirit of the subjugated, the powerless, here every other man is, to the individual, hostile, inconsiderate, greedy, inhuman, avaricious. Be he noble or servile, bad is the characteristic term for man, for every living being, indeed, that is recognized at all, even for a god, human, divine. These notions are tantamount to devilish, bad. Manifestations of goodness, sympathy, helpfulness are regarded with anxiety as trickiness, preludes to an evil end, deception, subtlety, in short, as refined badness. With such a predisposition in individuals, a feeling in common can scarcely arise at all. At most only the rudest form of it, so that everywhere that this conception of good and evil prevails, the destruction of the individuals, their race and nation, is imminent. Our existing morality has developed upon the foundation laid by ruling races and castes. 92. Origin of justice. Justice, reasonableness, has its origin among approximate equals in power, as Thucydides, in the dreadful conferences of the Athenian and Melian envoys, has rightly conceived. Thus, where there exists no demonstrable supremacy and a struggle leads but to mutual useless damage, the reflection arises that an understanding would best be arrived at and some compromise entered into. The reciprocal nature is hence the first nature of justice. Each party makes the other content inasmuch as each receives what it prizes more highly than the other. Each surrenders to the other what the other wants and receives in return its own desire. Justice is therefore reprisal, and exchange upon the basis of an approximate equality of power. Thus revenge pertains originally to the domain of justice, as it is a sort of reciprocity. Equally so gratitude. Justice reverts naturally to the standpoint of self-preservation, therefore to the egoism of this consideration. Quote, why should I injure myself to no purpose, and perhaps never attain my end? Unquote. So much for the origin of justice, only because men, through mental habits, have forgotten the original motive of so-called justice and rational acts, and also because for thousands of years children have been brought to admire and imitate such acts, have they gradually assumed the appearance of being unegotistical. Upon this appearance is founded the high estimate of them, which, moreover, like all estimates, is continually developing, for whatever is highly esteemed is striven for, imitated, made the object of self-sacrifice, while the merit of the pain and emulation thus expended is, by each individual, ascribed to the thing esteemed. How slightly moral would the world appear without forgetfulness! A poet could say that God had posted forgetfulness as a sentinel at the portal of the temple of human merit. 132. Of the Christian need of salvation. Careful consideration must render it possible to propound, some explanation of that process in the soul of a Christian, which is termed need of salvation, and to propound an explanation too, free from mythology, hence one purely psychological. Heretofore psychological explanations of religious conditions and processes have really been in disrepute, inasmuch as a theology calling itself free gave vent to its unprofitable nature in this domain. For its principal aim, so far as may be judged from the spirit of its creator, Schleiermacher, was the preservation of the Christian religion and the maintenance of the Christian theology. It appeared that in the psychological analysis of religious facts a new anchorage and above all a new calling were to be gained. Undisturbed by such predecessors, we venture the following exposition of the phenomena alluded to. Man is conscious of certain acts which are very firmly implanted in the general course of conduct. Indeed, he discovers in himself a predisposition to such acts that seem to him to be as unalterable as his very being. How gladly he would essay some other kind of acts which in the general estimate of conduct are rated the best and highest. How gladly he would welcome the consciousness of well-doing which ought to follow unselfish motive. Unfortunately, however, it goes no further than this longing, the discontent consequent upon being unable to satisfy it, added to all other kinds of discontent which result from his life destiny in particular, or which may be due to so-called bad acts, so that a deep depression ensues, accompanied by a desire for some physician to remove it and all its causes. This condition would not be found so bitter if the individual but compared himself freely with other men, for then he would have no reason to be discontented with himself in particular, as he is merely bearing his share of the general burden of human discontent and incompleteness. But he compares himself with a being who alone must be capable of the conduct that is called unegoistic, and of an enduring consciousness of unselfish motive, with God. It is because he gazes into this clear mirror that his own self seems so extraordinarily distracted and so troubled. Thereupon the thought of that being, in so far as it flits before his fancy as retributive justice, occasions him anxiety. In every conceivable small and great experience he believes he sees the anger of the being, his threats, the very implements and manacles of his judge and prison. What succours him in this danger, which, in the prospect of an eternal duration of punishment, transcends in hideousness all the horrors that can be presented to the imagination? (136) Of Christian asceticism and sanctity. Much as some thinkers have exerted themselves to impart an air of the miraculous to those singular phenomena known as asceticism and sanctity, to question which or to account for which upon a rational basis would be wickedness and sacrilege, the temptation to this wickedness is none the less great. A powerful impulse of nature has in every age led to protest against such phenomenon. At any rate, science, inasmuch as it is the imitation of nature, permits the casting of doubts upon the inexplicable character and the supernal degree of such phenomena. It is true that heretofore science has not succeeded in its attempts at explanation, The phenomena remain unexplained still, to the great satisfaction of those who revere moral miracles. For, speaking generally, the unexplained must rank as the inexplicable. The inexplicable is the non-natural, supernatural, miraculous. So runs the demand in the souls of all the religious and all the metaphysicians, even the artists, if they happen to be thinkers. Whereas the scientific man sees in this demand the, quote, evil principle, unquote. The universal first, apparent truth that is encountered in the contemplation of sanctity and asceticism is that their nature is complicated. For nearly always within the physical world as well as in the moral, the apparently miraculous may be traced successfully to the complex, the obscure, the multi-conditioned. Let us venture then to isolate a few impulses in the soul of the saint and the ascetic, to consider them separately, and then view them as a synthetic development. 137. There is an obstinacy against oneself, certain sublimated forms of which are included in asceticism. Certain kinds of men are under such a strong necessity of exercising their power and dominating impulses that, if other objects are lacking, or if they have not succeeded with other objects, they will actually tyrannize over some portions of their own nature or over sections and stages of their own personality. Thus do many thinkers bring themselves to views which are far from likely to increase or improve their fame. Many deliberately bring down the contempt of others upon themselves, although they could easily have retained consideration by silence. Others contradict earlier opinions and do not shrink from the ordeal of being deemed inconsistent. On the contrary, they strive for this and act like eager riders who enjoy horseback exercise most when the horse is skittish. Thus will men in dangerous paths ascend to the highest steeps in order to laugh, to scorn their own fear in their own trembling limbs. Thus will the philosopher embrace the dogmas of asceticism, humility, sanctity, in the light of which his own image appears in its most hideous aspect. This crushing of self, this mockery of one's own nature, this spionare sperne, out of which religions have made so much, is in reality but a very high development of vanity. The whole ethic of the Sermon on the Mount belongs in this category. Man has a true delight in mastering himself through exaggerated pretensions or excessive expedients, and later deifying this tyrannically exacting something within him. In every scheme of ascetic ethics, man prays to one part of himself as if it were God, and hence it is necessary for him to treat the rest of himself as devil. 142. To sum up all that has been said, that condition of soul at which the saint or expectant saint is rejoiced is a combination of elements which we are all familiar with, except that under other influences than those of mere religious ideation, they customarily arouse the censure of men in the same way that, when combined with religion itself and regarded as the supreme attainment of sanctity, they are object of admiration and even of prayer, at least in more simple times. Very soon the saint turns upon himself that severity that is so closely allied to the instinct of domination at any price, and at which inspire even in the most solitary individual the sense of power. Soon his swollen sensitiveness of feeling breaks forth from the longing to restrain his passions within it, and is transformed into a longing to master them as if they were wild steeds. The master impulse being ever that of a proud spirit. Next he craves a complete cessation of all perturbing, fascinating feelings, a waking sleep, an enduring repose in the lap of a dull animal, plant-like indolence. Next he seeks the battle and extinguishes it within himself because weariness and boredom confront him. He binds his self-deification with self-contempt. He delights in the wild tumult of his desires and the sharp pain of sin, in the very idea of being lost. He is able to play his very passions. For instance, the desire to domineer, a trick so that he goes to the other extreme of abject humiliation and subjection, so that his overwrought soul is without any restraint. Through this antithesis, and finally when indulgence in visions, in talks with the dead or with divine beings overcomes him, this is really but a form of gratification that he craves, perhaps a form of gratification in which all other gratifications are blended. Novalis, one of the authorities in matters of sanctity, because of his experience and instinct, betrays the whole secret with the utmost simplicity when he says, quote, "It is remarkable that the close connection of gratification, religion, and cruelty has not long ago made men aware of their inner relationship and common tendency." Unquote. (143) Not what the saint is, but what he was in the eyes of the non-sanctified gives him his historical importance. Because there existed a delusion respecting the saint, his soul states being falsely viewed, and his personality being sundered as much as possible from humanity as a something incomparable and supernatural. Because of these things he attained the extraordinary with which he swayed the imaginations of whole nations and whole ages. Even he knew himself not, for even he regarded his dispositions, passions and actions in accordance with a system of interpretation as artificial and exaggerated as the pneumatic interpretation of the Bible. The distorted and diseased in his own nature, with its blending of spiritual poverty, defective knowledge, ruined health, overwrought nerves, remained as hidden from his view as from the view of his beholders. He was neither a particularly good man nor a particularly bad man, but he stood for something that was far above the human standard in wisdom and goodness. Faith in him sustained faith in the divine and miraculous, in a religious significance of all existence, in an impending day of judgment, in the last rays of the setting sun of the ancient world, which fell upon the Christian peoples. The shadowy form of the saint attained enormous proportions, to such enormous proportions indeed, that down even to our own age, which no longer believes in God, there are thinkers who believe in the saints. 144. It stands to reason that this sketch of the saint, made upon the model of the whole species, can be confronted with many opposing sketches that would create a more agreeable impression. There are certain exceptions among the species who distinguish themselves either by a special gentleness or a special humanity, and perhaps by the strength of their own personality. Others are in the highest degree fascinating because certain of their delusions shed a particular glow over their whole being, as is the case with the founder of Christianity, who took himself for the only begotten Son of God, and hence felt himself sinless, so that through his imagination, that should not be too harshly judged, since the whole of antiquity swarmed with sons of God, he attained the same goal, the sense of complete sinlessness, complete irresponsibility that can now be attained by every individual through science. In the same manner have viewed the saints of India, who occupy an intermediate station between the Christian saints and the Greek philosophers, and hence are not to be regarded as a pure type. Knowledge and science, as far as they existed, and superiority to the rest of mankind by logical discipline and training of the intellectual powers, were insisted upon by the Buddhists as essential to sanctity, just as they were denounced by the Christian world as the indications of sinfulness.